Okay, we're live. This is Senate Appropriations. We're going to be talking about education funding and appropriations. Julie Richter, contract this week.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with Joint Fiscal Office. It's nice to see all of you again. Work in education finance. The chair asked me to come in today and do a bit of less of a primer and more of an education fund and the Senate Committee on Appropriations. And so, you know, where all of the pieces fit together with a focus on this committee. As a whole, I believe there's 3 documents on the committee page under my name.
The fund outlook in the annotated guide.
What for your up on that?
Maybe I just need to read. Okay, here.
Would you like me to share my screen?
I found.
With the slides?
Yeah, because
okay.
We don't have printouts. Most people.
Okay. I'm just gonna go ahead and share. And yeah, so there's 3 documents on the committee page under my name. One set of slides, which is sort of high level education fund and the appropriations committee, and some priming, level setting in terms of things to keep in mind when considering everything to consider. With respect to the ed fund, there's also 2 other documents on the committee page.
And the 2 documents, they did have printouts of that. The overlook.
Wonderful. So, so one of them is, we'll talk about this in more detail, but just to sort of orient the committee, one is the education fund outlook, one that looks like this. We'll talk about what's in here in more detail, but big picture, this is really like, you can sort of think of it as an operating statement, so to speak, of the education fund. If you're an accountant, it's not an operating statement, but it's really telling us the ins and outs, how different policy choices may be impacting the education fund. And before getting into the slides, I just want to level set. This is the 3rd document. I think this is also printed out in front of you. We call this the annotated guide to the ed fund outlook. We put this together for the first time last year. And this is essentially in words what each one of those lines and its numbers mean and how to interpret them. So it's meant to be sort of a guide in terms of when looking at the ed fund outlook. But I guess, Chair, would you like me to just jump right in?
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of level setting, sort of 4 things that I'm prepared to talk to today. Just big picture overview of Vermont's ed finance system. Then a little bit deeper into the expenditures and appropriations out of the education fund. Talking about the revenues that go into the education fund, really high level, because it then leads to the question of buying down rates and other policy choices that are made in this committee, in finance, in education, and in the General Assembly as a whole. So high level, Vermont's ed finance system. These are total education costs are determined at the state and local level, also the federal level. But really what I'm focusing on here today is Vermont's education fund, which is all Vermont state dollars. There are a ton of federal dollars that flow to the state, as you will learn, I'm sure, over the course of the session, but I'm focusing here on state dollars. The way that it works, essentially, is school boards are building budgets that need to be approved by voters. Those budgets are culmination of pretty much everything that the school board needs in terms of funding the school district. At the same time, the General Assembly is making policies that impact the budgets and also making decisions about the statewide education fund. We'll talk about what those policies and decision points are. But a big one, and one of the reasons why I spend a lot of time in finance, is because the General Assembly sets the yields and the tax rates for calculating property taxes at a level necessary to ensure the ed fund is fully funded. So the ed fund is very different than the general fund in the context of, usually you start out with a picture of how many revenues you've got to work with, and then decide where those revenues are going and if you need to raise more revenues, right? The education fund is sort of the opposite. It's how much do we need to make, how much are we spending, and then how are we gonna fund it? The other nuance here is that homestead property tax rate, which is a function of district per pupil spending and not property wealth. So if you recall Act 60, Act 68, prior to that, a big part of property taxes were based off of the property wealth of the school district, right? The passage of Act 60 made it so that no longer are property taxes funding education a function of that district's property wealth, but instead the local spending decisions of that school district. So in terms of, and I'll go through if there's questions, I defer to how you all do it as a committee, but I'll just keep going. In terms of expenditures out of the education fund, helpful, I think, to first start at the local level. So school districts are building a budget annually. It usually starts in the fall. And then this goes through the entire budgeting process. It then requires local voter approval. The bulk of these happens over town meeting day in March. School boards are building their budgets, give them to the voters. If the voters approve it, there's their approved budget. We can think of those school budgets as having kind of two primary parts. There's the offsetting revenues of a school district budget, which is all of the revenues that are coming into the school district kind of associated with a purpose, is one way of thinking about it. So those are things like categorical aid, you know, a special education block grant, or transportation aid, federal dollars that are coming into the school district, if a school district's receiving tuition revenues from somebody else. So we take all of those offsetting revenues, we subtract that out of the budget, and everything left over is the school district's education spending. This is a term that plays into tax rates. I'm not going to go deep into the calculation of tax rates unless you want me to, but I'll just flag the fact that ed spending is a technical term in education finance, and it's referring to these budgets minus offsetting revenues. Mm-hmm. And then all of this is aggregated up to the state level. So all school budgets that need to be funded from state dollars become the education fund. The education fund also has other things coming out of it. So we can also think about these two buckets out of the ed fund. We've got the education payment, which is all of that ed spending we just spoke about, aggregated up, and then all of the other expenditures. So some of these are very formulaic, others are policy choices. You may have one-time appropriations coming out of the education fund.
When it says other operating and administrative costs at the state level, does that mean AOE?
No, so thank you for that clarification. So AOE, this is not, the education fund is not funding AOE. This is small pieces like the computer modernization fund at the tax department. This is, you'll see here on line 25 of your ed fund outlook that in FY25, I know that's really small, that's $5 million. So in the context of the ed fund, these are like very small accounting, auditing,
I see.
Technical pieces.
Why would the computer modernization fund be ed fund?
That was a policy choice.
Can you explain
that? I think I would, I would.
Because it doesn't immediately, intuitively.
I would encourage you to ask the commissioner of the tax department.
I'll do that.
It has to do, I believe, with the
property valuation,
PVR, and setting things up, but I don't want to speak off the cuff on the intent.
Yeah, it has to do with property valuation review and where you administer the statewide property tax.
So it's basically the machinery of, yeah. Okay.
Yes, I don't know.
Yes, so everybody here probably knows this answer, but I don't, So is that why when the school boards look at their budget, pass the budget, and then because of these other revenues, they don't really know what their taxes are going to be until the state? So they're the ones that always fall under the knife, so to speak, because they don't know what the taxes are. So that's, and what is that delay there roughly?
Yeah, so it's we'll get into this a little bit more in terms of the revenues in the ed fund. But you've got school districts that are starting to build their budget in the fall, early fall, working on that. Then we've got the December 1 letter. So the Ed Fund Outlook that you have right here in front of you is reflecting the December 1 letter, which is our best projection at this exact point in time, what we think will be coming in the upcoming fiscal year. It's based off of budget data that has not yet been warned. So school budgets will start to make those budgets public. They'll start to be voted on town meeting day. They'll continue to be voted on because not all school boards put their budgets to voters on town meeting day. Meanwhile, this body is going to be deliberating how much to raise on homestead property, how much to raise on non-homestead property, and all of those decisions will then accumulate into the yield bill, which is passed at the end of session. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's pretty complicated, but I'll learn more as I go along.
Okay.
Yeah, and the main thing why the school boards don't know what their tax rate is, because they don't know what the yield is, and you don't know the yield till the very end of the session. Because that's the main math thing that they don't know, which has a very large impact.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that yield figure is a mathematical exercise. It's a large part of my job, is to calculate what that yield needs to be in order to ensure the Ed Fund is fully funded. We can't calculate the yield until we know how much the education fund is as a total, like all school budgets, sorry.
The demand in the education fund
Exactly.
is?
And then there's also, we'll get into this in a second, I think, a couple more slides on expenditures, but then talk about why it is such a policy choice in terms of property taxes and how they're set. But coming back to the Ed Fund Outlook and expenditures in it, there's a section of that Ed Fund Outlook titled Appropriations. This is one of the reasons why it's not an accounting operating statement, because it's reflecting appropriations. It's not reflecting actual costs, right? And so what you're seeing here is the high level appropriations that are coming out of the education fund. And you will see over the course of the session, if there were to be a policy choice to introduce a new appropriation or reduce an appropriation or pull one out altogether, you would see that policy choice reflected in the Ed Fund Outlook. What we're seeing here is that all of those categorical aid appropriations like special education, transportation, tech ed, flexible pathways. You're also seeing that education payment in line 11 as what we talked about, that sum of education spending, and that's the largest appropriation out of the education fund. So in general, all of the appropriations from the Ed Fund are included in the big bill. So that's one place where you will be seeing these appropriations coming through the committee. Some of the appropriations are formulaic. Others reflect policy choices at the local and state level. I did just touch on this, but that education payment, which is the sum of education spending, is the largest appropriation in the Ed Fund, and it's about, in FY25, 80% of total uses of the Ed Fund. Deeper into that Ed payment line, about 70 to 80% of that is personnel cost. So that's what's flowing out of the Ed Fund in a 10-minute nutshell. And then moving into the revenue side of things, the education funding. So again, following that trend of buckets, we can think of the education fund as having kind of two different buckets of funding: property taxes and non-property taxes. The non-property taxes are sales and use tax, portion of meals and rooms, purchase and use, all lottery proceeds. Last year, there was a one-time general fund transfer that we'll talk about in more detail. And then you see these two boxes here. These green boxes are property taxes, which make up the majority of the education fund funding.
But can I ask why we always separate out non-property tax from property tax? For the Ed Fund, because the ed fund really is made up of property taxes and the other sources. But we always break it out and show them on separate sheets, so it's hard to figure, it creates a division. Why do we do that?
I think that's touching on a really important nuance of ed finance, which is the way that we think about the ed fund as a whole. We start out and calculate all uses of the education fund, right? That's our starting point. And then we say, how much are we raising from non-property revenue sources? And we subtract everything we're raising from non-property revenue sources from the total uses. And the remaining need that we don't have funding for, that's what we need to raise property taxes to fill. So that remainder is fluctuating dependent on total uses and also the performance of our non-property revenue sources.
Well, that makes sense the way you explain it, how we do that.
Yep.
But in actual terms, if we think the rate's gonna be too high and that, we start adding things back in. We put surplus money in. Last year we put, did the Airbnb, short-term rental piece on top. We added the sales tax to, cloud stuff. It makes sense the way you go through the analytical piece to get to do that. It just isn't practically the way I think about it. I think about the ed fund as a whole, and it's not like the ed fund isn't growing all the time with property values going up and all of that sort of piece. And the biggest single funding source becomes the property tax.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. It is completely true. We've got the education fund. It's receiving sales and use, all of sales and use. It's receiving purchases and use. It's receiving all of our homestead property taxes. It's receiving all of our non-homestead property taxes. I think it's helpful from some perspectives, and I'm often, talking to finance and talking to Ways and Means because it's coming at it of the perspective of setting those property tax rates, but you're certainly correct. They're all revenues, they're all flowing into the same fund.
Because it's not the way we look at, it's not the way we look at the general fund, it's not the way we look at the transportation fund. We put all the revenues on one page and then we do the calculation versus our spending. In this instance, we separate them all the time.
Yeah, so I would, I know you know this, but
this is, you don't need to humor me. You should go on, but it just bugs me.
I hear you. I will also note, if I may, that the Ed Fund Outlook does include so you see those properties in revenues in lines 1 and 2, and then all of your non-property in lines 3 through 9, which is another reason why I like to point people towards the Ed Fund Outlook so that they can see, here are all of the revenues, here are all of the uses. One challenge is that the state economists, as you know, they don't forecast the property tax for the education fund. They're only forecasting those non-property taxes. So the only place that I'm aware of really that we're keeping track of all of these is on the Ed Fund Outlook.
Senator Ruth?
Quick question. I thought I remembered from a long time ago when I was on economic development that liquor dropped into the ed fund. Has that never been the case? Did I remember that wrong?
I don't know. I will look into that and get back to you.
Or I'm wondering if when we made the switch
For
because
sales tax?
yeah,
They
pulled it
I
out.
don't know. Steve Klein's gone.
Yeah.
Janet Ansel and Steve Klein, that was their big thinking now.
Yeah, so we made that agreement to use different revenue sources, and I'm thinking maybe liquor got pulled out at that point.
I will certainly look into that. I will say that this switch in 2018 where the Ed Fund got all of sales and use and you had this parsing out. JFO did publish an issue brief last year that outlines both the history of what happened and also what the performance was.
And how the general fund got beat.
And
Yeah.
does liquor drop into the general fund now?
I don't know,
Okay,
but I will look into it and get back to you.
because that's like 24,
Or it could be a
25
special
million or
fund.
something a year.
Yeah, the general fund got beat in the deal.
Okay,
All right, so we've got the revenues in the ed fund outlook. We could spend hours walking through how each of those are calculated. That was not my charge for today, but I'm happy to come back or talk to any of you offline about that. But focusing in on property taxes, because these are what are fluctuating every year in order to make up that gap to fully fund the ed fund. These are set to keep the ed fund fully balanced, set annually, and we talked about, we've got our total uses, less non-property revenues, and then that remainder, that's what's being filled by property. There's two types of property tax under current law. There's non-homestead and there's homestead. Homestead is where somebody lives, their principal dwelling and all land surrounding it. Non-homestead is literally everything else, from apartment buildings, businesses, short-term rentals, deer camp, all subject to non-homestead property taxes. A big policy choice that's made annually is how much of that remainder that needs to be raised from property taxes, how much is being raised on homestead, and how much is being raised on non-homestead. That's a policy choice that needs to be made annually. So going a little bit deeper, I was asked to touch on the term buying down rates, and what that means. So there are different ways that the General Assembly may choose to decrease property taxes. Big picture, you could decrease the uses of the education fund, right? Decrease what's being appropriated. You'll recall a lot of that is formulaic in nature, or it's the funding of a voter-approved school budget. The other way to do that, of decreasing the property tax across the state, is by increasing those non-property tax revenues, finding other funds to put into the ed fund so that less needs to be raised from property. This is all a policy choice.
like we did last year with the.
Exactly. And I actually have a slide of what happened last year to illustrate this. The term buying down rates generally refers to the use of one-time monies in order to decrease that overall property tax liability that needs to be raised. I also want to note, because I think this is a common misconception just in general, that buying down rates is not always necessarily going to be included in the big bill. It's not necessarily going to be coming through in the big bill or as an appropriation, because there's different ways that this can be done. And we'll talk about how this was done last year. But for instance, if ed fund surplus is used to buy down rates, you're not going to appropriate the ed fund surplus to the education fund for the purpose of buying down rates. You're just going to use that to fund school budgets, right? So last year, 69 million approximately was used to buy down fiscal year 25 rates. So this kind of consisted of three parts that are helpful to think of. It's also on the ed fund outlook. I know it's tiny, which is why I included bullets as well. But there was a one-time transfer in the big bill of 25 million of general fund to the education fund for the purpose of buying down property tax rates. This one-time transfer you can see in line 8 of the education fund outlook. There were two other kind of, if you want to think of them as pots that were used to buy down rates last year in terms of one-time money. One, you'll see in line 38A, down here at the bottom, was 13 million that was set aside for the purpose of buying down property tax rates. So in fiscal year 24, there was about 127 million in education fund surplus. And the General Assembly said, we anticipate property tax rates are going to be increasing next year. We're going to take 13 million of that surplus and set it aside for next year to buy down rates. For fiscal year 25, the General Assembly then used that 13 million set aside in addition to the 25 million one-time general fund to buy down rates. There was also 31 million in the ed fund of ed fund surplus, which you see in line 39, that was used to buy down property tax rates last year. This is really a policy choice, if you want to do this, and if so, how you want to do this.
Sorry, thank you. Just wondering about the surpluses, going into buying down the rate. So, the surpluses from the prior year were not automatically, maybe they would have otherwise been diverted, or I guess maybe another way to say it is it doesn't necessarily carry over to automatically buy down the rate if there's a surplus.
Precisely. So the way essentially that it works, right, is like the general fund and the education fund is working off of these forecasted revenues. If those revenues come in higher than were anticipated, there's dollars that are unobligated, unexpended in the education fund, sitting at the bottom line, on the bottom line. And then for the purpose of the December 1 letter, which is published by the Commissioner of Taxes, written out into statute, it tells us what do we need to assume. And for the purpose of the December 1 letter, we need to assume all surplus dollars are used to buy down tax rates. After the December 1 letter, it is completely a policy choice. The General Assembly could choose to just keep 33 million on the bottom line, could choose to use that 33 million for anything that they wanted to out of the education fund, or could use it to buy down property taxes. Last year, the choice was to use all of it to buy down property taxes.
And forgive me for not knowing this already, but I'm not recalling, there's not like a specific education reserve fund.
Yes.
Oh, there is. So
there is the stabilization reserve within the education fund.
But that's not on the outlook.
It actually is on the outlook. See, this is why the outlook is so great.
Yeah.
It's all there.
I thought I was gonna catch you on something that wasn't in there, so where is it on?
So,
39 million come from there?
No, so the 39
That's
million
the surplus.
That's the
was the surplus dollars.
Okay.
So the stabilization reserve you see on the ed fund outlook in this chunk here labeled stabilization reserve. Right now it's lines 33 through 36.
okay. Oh, I see.
That's where you get your 5%.
Exactly. So this is created in the statute. There's a recommendation of 5% of the prior year's net appropriations.
And last year in the next block, an additional reserve, that's where we spent everything down to zero.
Precisely. Yeah, so you're seeing here in that line 38, that 13 million you had set aside in FY24. FY25, you still had the 13 million in additional reserve that you spent out. The stabilization reserve is a completely distinct reserve.
So right now, the reserve is 52.1.
Right now, in FY25, that's correct, it's 52.1 million.
That's the 5% reserve.
Right.
Correct. Going into
Different than the offset
FY26,
reserve.
going into FY26, if you were to continue maintaining that practice of reaching that reserve target of 5%, you would need to transfer in an additional 3.5 million to reach that 5%, so that for FY26 it would be 55.6 million.
And that would be part of a general fund. Like that's where that money would normally come from.
This is all education fund, so this stabilization
you would
reserve
take
is
it
also
from-
education
But you
fund.
wouldn't take it from the property tax part, you would have to take it from sales tax revenue or something like that.
It's part of that whole pot of uses.
Right, so it doesn't really matter.
So,
But you're not using that 3 million when you calculate the yield.
It's a policy choice if you want to maintain that reserve target or if you want to pull out of that stabilization reserve. But for the purpose of the December 1 letter, one of the assumptions we need to make is that we are
Gonna do this.
fully funding our reserve. So here we needed to raise that 3.5 million to ensure that reserve is fully funded. So if you think of that pot of the ed fund, that 3.5 million is part of that total use.
So it is part of the use.
Mhm.
And so, and maybe you'll talk about this, when people talk about using the reserve to buy down the rates, that would be taking some of that 52.1 million that we have this year and putting it towards the.
Yes. Now, so when people talk about pulling from the reserve, assuming they're not talking about this tax rate offset reserve that no longer exists, they're talking about this pulling from the stabilization reserve, which would mean pulling it below that reserve target of 5%. So likely moving forward into the future, there would be a policy consideration of bumping that reserve back up to the target that you have in statute of 5%, which would require raising more funds.
We'd be further in the hole. Senator Norris, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. So in anticipation of the commissioner's letter, December 1 letter coming out, 5.9%, whatever that may be, anyways, regardless, is the 5.9% in his letter figured with us, or with us, not us, but with using the reserved funds? And if we don't, it's gonna change, or how does that work?
Sure, so the 5.9% is also in the Ed Fund Outlook. It's up at the top on the reserve, on the summary lines. And that's reflecting these assumptions that I keep referencing that we need to make for the purpose of the December 1 letter. One of those, so those assumptions are we need to assume that the stabilization reserve is at that 5%. We need to assume that the surplus is being used to uniformly lower property tax rates across the state.
It does not assume any of the reserve to be used. That's your question, like
Yes,
that,
yes.
December, they consider all the surplus, the end of the year carry forward, call it,
When he comes out with that
that
December
is
1 letter.
included, which is the 33 million.
Okay,
But the 5%, the 55.6, they would not touch that unless we vote.
thank you.
Correct.
If we thought the yield was too low and wanted to raise the yield, then we would add this money
Mhm.
for that. And that was part of the debate last year between the administration and legislature, because it was gonna be so high, 13.9%, they said, well, that's a reason to use the reserve. And this committee did not agree with that, because it was just gonna put us in a deeper hole for this year without a plan to do that, so we said, let's not do it and figure it out next year.
Thank you.
It would have affected our bond rating.
And it
Yeah.
could have affected our body. Did you also have a question?
Yeah, if we don't restore that, it does affect the bond rate, but my question, how much did, what this doesn't show is it shows us using the 13, but the additional reserve was much higher the year before that.
The,
Reserve or the surplus?
The additional reserve,
so, I'm not sure,
we
I
bought
understand.
down 13 million.
yeah,
And we bought that down, but in 23, what was that additional reserve?
so that additional, in 23, that additional reserve actually didn't exist.
Okay,
So that was in the FY 24 yield bill.
yep,
You established this new reserve called the tax rate offset reserve solely for the purpose of setting aside these 13 million to
Okay.
use to
Yep,
lower
perfect.
tax rates.
Because there was so much surplus in the ed fund that year.
Yeah,
So they, instead of just buying that year's rate down more, they said, let's put it into the following fiscal year. Because we're expecting a need,
mhm.
and that's what we use. But we don't have that for FY 26. Because we didn't set it up.
Yeah, so you had that one-time reserve of 13 million.
Yeah.
It was fully used last year, depleted. So, and if you wanted to add more funds back into it, you certainly could, but there's nowhere to draw more funds from.
Well, you could draw money from the unallocated reserve, but it just postpones it a year kind of thing.
Precisely.
but we have to add in, well, the way the letter gets calculated in the stabilization reserve, it has us refilling the 3.5.
The 3.5? Oh, the 3.5 million, yes, the 5, to get the full 5%. And it also has it using all the surplus money, the full 13.
Will be interesting to see when the governor puts out his, if,
What it does.
what he does.
So when this says, on line 39, when it says the prior year, they're meaning 25?
Yeah, so so when we look at the prior year unreserved unallocated, that line 39 of the Ed Fund Outlook, that's essentially saying prior fiscal year, after the books were closed and we saw how revenues performed, how much was left that was unreserved unallocated. And then that flows forward to the following fiscal year for policymakers to decide how to use those surplus dollars. So what we're seeing here in FY26 as projected in the December 1 letter is in FY25, there's projected to be 33 million in unreserved unallocated. You can see here that in line 40, all of those 33 million were used to buy down property taxes because there's 0.93 million on the bottom line. In the context of the Ed Fund, 0.93 is as close as we can get to zero for the purpose of setting property taxes.
So in 24, right, that's the first one, when there was 137 million surplus, all of that except the 13 million was used to buy down the rate? Or was it?
Not all of it.
Okay.
I have here, this next slide, because I didn't remember off the top of my head, how much was used each year for the purpose of buying down property taxes. So in FY23, 20 million was used to buy down property taxes. In FY24, 40 million, and then in FY25, 69 million.
So what happened with that rest of that 137 surplus?
It was used towards other policy choices. So I don't have I could pull up, I don't have right in front of me the,
Like one time?
outlook for FY23, but examples of that were one-time programs. You'll recall there was the one-time 15 million in the CTE rehab
Okay.
appropriation. I don't remember the bill number for that.
Yeah,
It was a
yeah.
few years ago, but
So things
that's
like
an
that.
example. Universal school meals was funded with surplus that first year. You set aside the 13 million for the tax rate offset reserve. So all of those, there was the one-time COLA payment, all of those one-time or other policy choices.
Okay. And this just seems to be a telling trend of when you use money to buy down the rate, you kind of have to put that money back in plus more money to buy down the rate. You can't kind of go the other way unless you deal with the spending side. Right?
Mm-hmm. I think one, the visual that I have in my head in terms of like using one-time money to buy down property taxes, you know, if you're assuming that ed spending is gonna continue to increase or even stay flat, you're buying down that property tax rate one time, the following year, you're starting at a lower point. So you're gonna see that increase where the increase is really just where it would have been the previous year if you hadn't bought it down, and then any increase on top of that. So it's kind of that valley that we were talking about last year.
So,
Just a quick question, on line 19, as a for instance, universal school meals, in 24 was 26.4, and this year the projected is 18.5, and the reason for that is the drop in population, student population, or
A big part of that drop has to do with the increase in the amount of federal funds that the state is able to draw down. So there was a Medicaid pilot program. So essentially, one big piece of this puzzle is the state has been able to account for more children who would qualify for the drawdown of federal funds for universal school meals, which then decreases the amount that the state needs to kick in to fully fund that
in
program.
the first year, we didn't have that data, so we had to pay for the full boat at 26 million.
okay.
And then as could show the feds that there's more and more of these people should get federal funding, we can do that. That's what brought it down to projected 18, which I think is what they're saying, that's kind of level off there, if I remember correctly.
I don't know what the forecast is going out in future years.
Okay, so that's your slides.
That's my slide.
Okay. And maybe you don't want to answer this question, it's fine. You're good at telling us when you don't want to. And that is, given the December 1st letter and discussions of trying to buy down the rate to zero or have a zero increase in people's property tax, do you have a number of what that would take to buy it down to zero?
Yeah, so I thought you might ask that. So in short, given the best available data that we have right now on the 16th of January, 4 days before the e-board of the new forecast, I can tell you that the projection is around 100 million to buy down to a 0% increase or bill change on average.
In addition to the surplus, because the surplus is already in that.
Correct.
So we'd have to come up with 100 million around there, based on the December 1st letter. And if we know the education fund is down 8 million, so it's gonna be a little bit more. And then if the forecast is showing less money for the education fund, we'd even be more than that 108 million, it'd be whatever, 120 million.
Correct. This is where, like, I wish I had like a big flag that said like caveats on it. This is when I would be raising that flag of saying, you know, we have this 100 million estimate right now, but as the chair mentioned, we have forecast revenues that are going to be coming into play. We also have school district budgets that aren't even warned yet, right? So we don't know how those will change over the coming months. There's also going to be a number of other policy choices that you may be grappling with that would impact the ed fund and would also impact this number. So this is very much a point in time estimate that it's not may change, it will change between now and May.
And the only money on the outlook that would be available for that 100 million would be the stabilization reserve.
If you wanted to pull money out of that reserve.
But if you were looking at the outlook and said, okay, I need 100 million, start looking at there, that's the only line where there's money that you could take.
In the short term, yes, that money would need to be paid back in future years.
Cancel free programs.
The other option would be to, cut the uses. But yeah, there's not 100 million magical dollars in here.
You'd have to go somewhere else within the state budget, the general fund or somewhere. You'd have to go find that money.
Or
increase
raise
revenue.
a new revenue.
Right. Increase revenue, take it from somewhere else, or decrease the spending.
Correct.
Okay. So,
Lovely.
Exactly. And then next year, you'd have 100 million plus whatever.
right.
Right, 100 million.
Plus, yeah, you go to 150 million the next year, if you want to do the 5% reserve. I mean, that's why the
never ending story.
spending part of it is difficult because you're increasing the reserves and everything else you need. That is based on in the property taxes. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah.
Grady, back for the
Hello again, Grady Nixon, Joint Fiscal Office. So let me just share my screen.
You're not on.
What's that?
You're not here yet.
I think I am.
She's really savvy about legislative.
Could you send me the link?
I did, but I can invite you to straight from here if you want to.
Yeah, it'd be great.
So Grady's going to tell us how the budget is organized.
Thank God.
It'll all be clear after Grady's presentation.
I think this should be pretty short and sweet.
He's only got 10 seconds. 11 seconds.
What goes in, what goes out.
Send it to you.
You wanna run it from there, and you could just
Ah.
tell you, there you go.
Yeah.
The same slide you shared. I thought he stole it from you.
No, I wasn't going to say anything though. Okay, so this is the same slide that Amy showed you. I just wanted to call your attention to it again. This is just the budget process. So every year, the state has an annual operating budget. That process starts in September and October. Agencies work on their budgets. Then the governor's team in November, December meets with agencies and departments. They work on it. The governor submits his budget by the third week of January. Then the House Appropriations Committee takes control of it. They work on it. And then it comes over to the Senate in February, where you all work on it. And then there's a committee of conference appointed to wrap everything up and reconcile the differences between the two bills. In terms of reading the budget, it has a different numbering structure than any other bill. So other bills have section 1, section 2, and so on. The budget has a bit of different system. So there's multiple sections of different lettered sections, which we'll get into in a moment. And I would also just note that it has a different numbering system from the Budget Adjustment Act. So the Budget Adjustment Act uses the standard section 1, section 2, so on, whereas the budget has this A, B, C, D, E section set up. The good thing is that numbering structure is the same year to year. So if you're comparing budgets, you all have your different areas of the budgets. When you go to prior year budget packs, you'll be able to look and know what's changed year to year. Also, a lot of what's in the budget itself is just standard annual language. When you receive the governor recommend, you'll see that under a lot of the explanations for different sections. And that's not a smoke screen. It truly is standard annual language that's just in there year to year. So every year there will be A, B, C, D, and E sections, and then there will also be other sections when the appropriations committees decide to drag other bills into the budget. So we'll discuss that.
And did they get another number, F, G?
Yeah, so it would continue on. So the A sections are the annual explanatory sections at the beginning of the bill. These include the purpose of the bill, definitions for terms that are used in the budget bill, and then the legend, which is section A108. And that's probably the most useful section in the budget in terms of if you ever forget how it's organized, that A108 section just explains to you very quickly.
It's kind of like the table of contents.
Exactly. So this is section A108. This is what it looks like. It's very early on in the budget. And you'll see here, the budget is organized by functions of government. And so sections B100 through B9999, which is in a section B999, but just those are the quote unquote number sections. And then for those number sections, there are E sections, which is directive language relating to those number sections. So for instance, the treasurer's office is B134 and also, or no, sorry, that's pensions. The treasurer's office is B132 and E132. And if there were multiple sections pertaining to the treasurer for language, those would be E132 and then E132.1 and so on. So if there's multiple sections relating to one function of government, that's how we just show that it's still connected to that same B section. So the B sections, like I said, they're what we refer to as the numbers sections. So you'll hear that a lot as we're going through the budget process. When you're working on the bill itself, a lot of times the printout of the language that you'll be looking at won't have those numbers sections. We generate those after the committees do their straw votes. That's something we complete over the weekend typically. But you will see those in the GovRec. So B sections are base appropriations. There are one-times in other sections that we'll get into in a moment. But the B sections are where all of the base appropriations for the coming fiscal year live. And those match the web report. So I mentioned yesterday afternoon, the web report is basically a more detailed version of what you see in the budget for those B sections.
And why is it called the web report? Do we know?
It's a terrible name. We discussed before the session started about updating the name to be more descriptive, and we didn't come up with anything. So,
you don't call it like a more detailed budget. Like what would be a more descriptive name for it?
Anything that refers to it as not the web report, because we constantly are printing it out, and then by definition, that's no longer a web report. So it's a bit of a misleading.
The budget.
Yeah, it's you can think of the web report as the number sections of the budget with more information there. So,
but not the language from the E sections don't go.
They don't go in the web report.
It's just more numbers.
It's just more numbers. And the web report includes, it shows sort of that decision-making process. So you'll see numbers from the GovRec to the House, to the Senate, to the Committee of Conference. Whereas at any stage in the bill, the B sections are just reflective of the bill as it exists in that stage.
Underline suggests we call it the progress report. Because that's
You're
the progress
going from the governor to the House to the Senate, right?
That's good.
There you go.
Because the web, yeah, it's a tracking to your progress.
You need legislative approval to change the.
We can add it to the budget.
Yeah, that's right. This shall no longer be called the web.
And so you'll see for each of the B sections, at the top, the title of the section tells you the function area. So for instance, this is B100. This is the first number section in that section. So that's the Secretary's Office for the Agency of Administration. Then you'll see the personal services, operating expenses, grants. So those are the allocations. That's where the appropriations are being divvied up. And then below that, you'll see the source of funds. So you'll see general fund, special fund, if there were ed funds or transportation funds, and so on, ARPA funds, things like that. Those will be on the left, and then on the right, it shows you the actual amounts being appropriated there. And the top and bottom should always line up with each other. We've screwed up if they don't. And so then there are other B sections. So the B100 through B9999 includes a number of one-time sections. So the B1100s is what I normally refer to it as. So these are one-time appropriations for the coming fiscal year. This will include general fund appropriations, federal fund appropriations. So if there's a big federal stimulus package, then oftentimes we'll deal with those as one-time dollars in sections like this. This is also where the General Assembly can sometimes go chasing waterfalls, which was a term that Senator McKitchell did not like, but you'll see section B1102 in Act 113, so this current fiscal year's budget. That was the unobligated contingent list. So that was a list where we knew that there would be more money available, but we weren't certain exactly how much. So we had a list that said, in this order, make these appropriations to the extent that funds are available. So that's something that would live there. And then the cash fund also gets pulled into the B1100 sections. So those are, you'll see section B1103 is what it was last year, but those change from year to year where they are. I would say B1100 is always going to be that long list of the miscellaneous one-time appropriations. Then we have the C sections. So the C sections are current year. You can think of C as standing for current year adjustments, appropriations, and amendments. So the purpose of the Budget Adjustment Act is to make those current year fiscal changes. But unfortunately, we don't always catch everything that we need to change in the Budget Adjustment Act, even though we try. So the budget then becomes the next opportunity to make those changes to the current fiscal year. These sections can address funding shortfalls, they can shift around funds, make transfers, and they can change time-sensitive policy. And these sections are typically effective on passage because they're supposed to make changes as quickly as possible. So you'll see, for instance, this is C section, or section C 117. So the administration, after the budget adjustment closed, told us that we could actually, the take up for school meals was less than they thought. So they're able to further reduce that appropriation in the C section, which made more money available for fiscal year 2025. Then we have the D sections. So these are transfers, reversions, and reserve allocations for the coming fiscal year. Section D100 will always be the allocation of the property transfer tax. Section D101 will always be fund transfers, and section D102 will always be reversions.
You want to give us your quick description on transfers versus reversions?
So transfers are between funds. Reversions are funds or spending authority that is returning to the fund that things were being appropriated out from. So transfer would be X number of dollars from the general fund to the clean water fund. A reversion would be a reversion of spending authority from an agency or department to the fund where that spending authority was coming from.
Back to the general fund.
Back to the general fund or ed fund
or whatever.
Yeah. E sections, you can think of as everything else. So mostly. So this is where language that corresponds to the numbers sections lives. I should note there isn't an E section for every B section, but every E section that is in the bill links up with a B section, if that makes sense. So when you're flipping through the bill, even if there isn't language relating to a particular function of government, that doesn't mean that in the web report and other documents, no one knows what they're supposed to do with those funds. It's just the E sections are when there's a need for further guidance or direction.
So if it's always gone to that same thing, you might just have the number and not an E section because it's just always been that.
Right, or the General Assembly might not feel the need to put in any clarification or direction about the purpose of those funds. So, for instance, the Agency of Administration Secretary's office, there might not be language about it because it's there's nothing particular that the General Assembly wants other than for that office to be funded.
Right.
So the E sections will have a mix of annual language and new language. The majority of what comes over in the Governor Rec, or maybe not majority as in like 80%, but I would say about half of it is annual language. And then there will be new language as well. And then obviously while you all are working on the bill, everything that gets added at that point is new language. Annual language will typically have the same number year to year. So again, if you're flipping through old bills, those sections year to year will be the same. So on this page right here, we have section E208 and then E208.1. Just as an example, E208, that's annual language, that's always in there. E208.1 was a particular report request that was new language in last year's budget, or this fiscal year's budget. And as I mentioned, if two or more E sections relate to one particular B section, they'll be numbered like this. So it will be E208, E208.1, E208.2, and so on. And so then we have the F through Z sections. So there aren't that many, but just to show that that's how we would continue on. So this changes year to year. Sometimes they aren't in the bill at all. Sometimes, but these are sections that get pulled into the bill from most of the time, other bills. So for instance, in Act 113, the F sections were financial regulation fees that got pulled into the budget, and the G sections were the Pay Act. So we took the entirety of the Pay Act and put it into this fiscal year's budget. And then you have the H section, which is the effective dates. And the effective dates section will change, the lettering for it will change depending on how many of those other lettered sections we have, but it will always be its own section. It will always be the last one.
Oh, that's neat.
Well done.
Oh, wow.
Thought that would be a nice little end of the day treat.
Impressive.
So just to wrap up, a lot of what's in the budget is annual and standard. Some of what's in the governor's recommended budget will get pulled into the BAA. So that's something that the committee should be aware of as we're going through the budget process. Once you get the governor recommend, there will be those C sections that are adjusting the current fiscal year. And frequently the House will pull those C sections out of the budget and put them into their version of the BAA. So when the bill comes over from the House, it's likely that it will look like the House struck a lot of sections that the governor recommended, but that's because they dragged them into the BAA. Just why not do it sooner than later? Things that are missed in the Budget Adjustment Act will also get pulled into the budget. So even though the House will probably take some of the C sections out of the governor recommended and put them into their BAA, there will be C sections in the budget no matter what, because people are fallible and there will be issues that come up that neither JFO nor the governor's office was aware of at the passage of the BAA. A sections explain the bill, B sections appropriate funds, C sections affect the current fiscal year, D sections move money around, E sections contain language relating to corresponding B sections, and all other sections vary year to year and come from other bills. Any questions?
Very good. Is there a marching band at the end or anything?
No, I should have included some fanfare.
Yeah, that's
There-
what we do.
There will be other.
Okay.
Yeah, stick with that.